Friends, welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It's not difficult for you, but it's nice for me, and we're starting. Chapter 1. The first witness called by the state of Florida was Clive Pickett, the rather rustic sheriff of Brunswick County, a sparsely populated corner of northwest Florida, the so-called outgrowth. Sheriff Pickett came to the podium in full uniform and swore to tell the truth. His job was to describe the crime scene and tell the jury what they found. The victims were in the woman's bedroom and were apparently caught in the act. She was married to another man, just like him. At some time between 1400 hours and 1500 hours on January 17, 1995, the accused, sitting over there at the defense table, allegedly broke into the house and found them. He was married to this woman and knew this man well. The first large color photograph, State Exhibit 1, was an exterior shot of an old wooden house located on Tinley Road, about 2 miles from the Tapacola Reservation and thus not on tribal land, but in the county and under the jurisdiction of Sheriff Pickett. The sheriff explained that there were no signs of forced entry in the house. The 1984 Ford truck parked in the driveway belonged to a deceased gentleman, one son Rasco. In the second photo, number 2, a woman was lying across the bed, on her back, her head and shoulders surrounded by blood, which covered the white sheets. As usual, the defense attorney objected to this photo on the usual grounds. She was inflammatory, biased, and so on, but his objections were overruled. Crime scene photos, regardless of their degree of horror, were always taken into consideration. The jurors willingly handed over the second photo, even when they stared at it in horror. Some looked away, unable to concentrate on what they were holding in their hands. It was the same with the third photo, Exhibit 3, which showed a man sprawled on the floor in a pool of his own blood. The next two photographs, evidence numbers 4 and 5, depicted the bedroom and the bodies, but from different angles. By the time the photographs were laid out in the courtroom, the jurors were looking at the defendant as if they themselves were impatient to bring the justice they deserved. A large diagram was mounted on a tripod next to the jury box, and the prosecutor led the sheriff through a plan of the house, 2 acres around it, Tinley Road, and nearby tribal lands. He stressed the remoteness of the crime scene. The nearest house was 300 yards away and was not visible from the driveway. Having carefully prepared the scene, the prosecutor released the witness. The cross-examination yielded nothing new and lasted only a few minutes. Sheriff Pickett was released from the witness stand and, since he would no longer be called, he was allowed to remain in the courtroom. The accused. His name was Junior Mace. He was a Tapacola Indian, 37 years old, the father of 3 children and the husband of Eileen, the woman he was accused of murdering. Before his arrest, he drove a pickup truck and delivered propane for a company from Moorville. The salary barely allowed his family to stay afloat. He and Eileen had a small mortgage on the old house they bought from her parents before they died. Since he had no money, he had to settle for the services of a court-appointed lawyer. Junior was a big man, over 6 feet tall, thin, with long dark hair that fell to his collar. The 15 months he spent in prison awaiting trial did not lighten his swarthy skin. He wore the same clothes to court every day: faded jeans, boots, a brown leather shirt, and beads on both wrists. He sat straight and proud, absorbing every word without flinching, although he wanted to shout his innocence. Chapter 2. The second witness was a provincial policeman named Willard, who, despite being called a homicide detective, was no more than a senior deputy in Sheriff Pickett's small group. According to him, in 11 years of working for the sheriff, he investigated only 4 other murders, although the defense attorney did not mention this. For the occasion, Willard donned his only club jacket, which he had purchased many years ago before gaining his last 80 pounds, 32 kilograms. Willard told the jury that police immediately began looking for Eileen's husband, defendant Junior Mays, not as a suspect, but as a family member. Strangely enough, a bartender 15 miles from the crime scene called the sheriff's office around 7 o'clock in the evening and said that Junior was sitting in his pickup truck, leaning on the steering wheel, too drunk to drive, and needed help. The bartender knew Junior and said he was just trying to warn the police and secure the roads. Willard and 2 other deputies rushed to the bar and found Junior in his pickup truck, unconscious and barely breathing. They called an ambulance, and he was taken to a hospital in Walton County. After he was taken away, Willard searched his pickup truck without a warrant and found a Smith & Wesson pistol with 2 rounds in the chamber. He also found a wallet belonging to son Rasko under the front seat. Exhibit 6 was a Smith & Wesson, an unlicensed firearm with an erased registration number. Exhibit 7 was a wallet containing Mr. Rasko's driver's license, 1 credit card from a bank, 1 from an oil company, and $17 in cash. All this was transferred to the meeting room. Months earlier, the defense had challenged the search without a warrant on the grounds that there were neither sufficient grounds nor good legal reasons to rummage through the pickup truck. The judge, however, ruled that the search was lawful, so the gun and wallet were accepted as evidence. Judge. Her name was Claudia McDover, and she was 40 years old. Last year, she won the election of a candidate for the position of judge with 18 years of experience by a margin of 1,000 votes. This was her first fatal murder case. Moreover, it was her first murder case of any kind. Before becoming a judge, she practiced law in a small town with a decent reputation and modest success. Her campaign was well funded, and she knocked on all doors for several months, promising, as always, strict law and order in court. She strongly supported the death penalty and, at least to the lawyers watching the case, it seemed that she was determined to get the death penalty in the case of Junior Mays. She felt obligated to her constituents, the residents of rural Northwest Florida. Chapter 3. The third witness was the bartender himself. His name was Spike, and it was obvious that Spike had spent most of his life either on one side of the bar or the other. His long gray hair was pulled back in a ponytail. The ears were decorated with metal. A white, perfectly pointed goatee dripped from his chin. On the witness stand, Spike looked as relaxed as he had when handing out alcohol. He explained to the jury that Junior visited him at least once a week for a beer after work and was usually talkative and in a pleasant mood. But during the last visit, he was clearly worried about something. He quickly drank 2 bottles of beer. Junior always drank beer only from bottles, never on tap or from cans, and said nothing. He sat down at the end of the bar and stared straight ahead, lost in another world. A crowd of customers entered, and the bartender busied himself with something else. He noticed that Junior had walked away from the bar and was throwing darts with a man the bartender had never seen before. Junior always paid in cash, so there was no record of how many beers he ordered. In addition, the stranger himself bought beer in several rounds. Spike didn't see Junior leave the bar, but around 6:30 a.m., one of the patrons whispered to him that some drunk had passed out in the parking lot. Spike went outside, found Junior sitting against the wall, and managed to get him into his pickup truck. When Spike asked him for the keys, Junior refused and seemed aggressive for a second. Then Spike called Clive Pickett's office and said they might have a problem here. Within 20 minutes, Officer Willard and 2 other police officers were there. Spike said he was stunned to hear about the murders, but looking back, he realized that it made sense. Something was definitely wrong with Junior that last visit. The owner of the bar. He owned several bars in Florida, as well as several salons, liquor stores, and a strip club. 3 months before the murder, he bought the bar where Junior was staying. He paid too much for it, but by that time he already knew about Junior's movements and decided that this was the perfect place. He was in court to observe the testimony of Spike, his employee, and make sure that Spike adheres to the version that Junior came that day in upset feelings and behaved strangely. Although Junior usually limited himself to 2 or 3 beers and probably did so that day, it was important to convey to the jury the image of a troubled man who got very drunk, so drunk that he collapsed near the bar building. Junior's loss of consciousness had nothing to do with alcohol, but this secret will be kept forever. All this was arranged by the owner of the bar. Disguised and sitting in the back row, he smugly watched Spike on the witness stand as the pieces of his neat little plot fell into place. He lived in the shadow of his own dark world, where hard money was king and from where he had to eliminate unnecessary people from time to time. Chapter 4. The fourth witness was a ballistics expert named Montgomery from the State Crime Lab. He performed in a nice suit and dark tie and impressed everyone with his qualifications. 4 bullets were recovered from the crime scene, 2 from son Rasko's head, 1 from Eileen May's head, and 1 from a mattress. The 4th bullet entered her skull an inch above her right eyebrow, went through the entire brain, and made a terrifying exit wound about 3 inches in diameter. The physical evidence of State 8, 9, 10, and 11 were enlarged photographs of bullets. In technical terms, Montgomery explained that removing bullets immediately allows you to determine the make and model of the weapon, in this case, a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson pistol. Using a large diagram, posing as a learned professor, he explained that when fired, each bullet twists as it passes through the barrel, which is called slicing in professional jargon. This leaves microscopic marks and grooves on the bullet and allows an expert like him to determine which weapon fired a particular bullet. He had no doubt that the weapon retrieved from Junior's pickup truck had fired 4 bullets. State evidence numbers 12, 13, 14, and 15 were the bullets themselves. The prosecutor handed Montgomery 4 spent shell casings. The expert told the jury that these 4 shell casings were found in the bedroom. Whoever fired them was in too much of a hurry to collect them. Using a comparative microscope, he was able to determine that all 4 cartridges were fired from the same Smith & Wesson pistol. Most of his testimony was technical, and although it was interesting at first, it soon became tedious. He was an expert. If he said the bullets were fired from a pistol from Junior's pickup truck, who could dispute that? State evidence numbers 16, 17, 18, and 19 were spent casings. Montgomery's cross-examination by the defense attorney was mild. What could he really do? It was obvious that everything had happened in the bedroom. Defense attorney. His name was Larry Svoboda, 31 years old, an aspiring criminal defense lawyer from Panama City. There was a public defender in Brunswick County, a rather useless man who took time off, citing some obscure conflict of interest. The truth was that he had never touched criminal cases and still wanted to quit his job. Judge McDover knew that he was too inexperienced and appointed Svoboda, who initially wanted to get this case. However, soon after he received it, he realized that he had meddled in the wrong business. Like all criminal defense lawyers, Svoboda knew that almost all of his clients claimed to be innocent. Junior was no exception. Since their first meeting in prison, Junior has vehemently protested the charges. He was framed in an ideal situation. He loved his wife, never cheated on her, and son was his friend once. He was delivering goods at the time of the murder. He didn't have a gun, and he hadn't fired one in over 20 years. After 15 months of listening to Junior, Svoboda finally believed him. Chapter 5. The 5th witness was also from the state crime lab. Dr. Unger was a pathologist whose task was to describe in horrifying detail the injuries inflicted on the victims by 4 bullets. He had a stack of color photographs, state evidence from numbers 20 to 29, Son Rasco and Eileen Mays on the stove while he poked and dug into their brains, tracing the trajectories of projectiles and describing the damage. Svoboda's lawyer objected again and again, arguing that the testimony and physical evidence were excessive and caused serious damage. Her Honor thought otherwise, and for 3 hours the jury writhed while Dr. Unger went about his business. He presented large diagrams, physical evidence from numbers 30 to 33, which depicted the exact routes traveled by bullets. And he concluded his testimony by concluding that all 4 bullets were fired from a pistol at close range. During cross-examination, Svoboda did not score any points. After all, it was pretty obvious how the 2 victims died. What difference does it make if the killer fired from a distance of 5 feet or 6 inches? Disappointed, Svoboda threw his notebook on the defense table and fell into a chair. Then he made the mistake of looking at the jury, almost all of whom were looking either at him or at his client. After 3 days of the trial, it was obvious to him, like to all the other people in the courtroom, that the defense was not doing very well. The jury, 9 whites, 3 blacks, not a single Native American. Equal separation by gender. All registered voters of Bay County, neighboring Brunswick. 3 with higher education, 2 without a job. The average age is 52 years old. So there is a lot of gray hair. Conservatives, representatives of the middle class, mostly Protestants, tired of crime and senseless violence that destroys the stability of our society. During the selection process, all 12 claimed that they did not object to the death penalty. The judge warned them not to discuss the case before the final discussion, but such precautions were usually ignored. During lunch breaks and long breaks in the trial, when the lawyers returned to their offices and discussed the intricacies of the law, the jurors whispered to each other. Some of the men in particular were intrigued by what Junior would say if he actually testified. To catch a wife in bed with another man, and even with a friend, and a violent reaction can be understandable. A good beating, maybe a few broken bones. Junior definitely looked like a man who could bleed with his hands, especially in a rage. But 2 bullets in the head? It seemed like such a cold-blooded revenge. The women have heard enough. They could have forgiven a couple of shots to injure a man, but killing Eileen was too much. Chapter 6. The sixth witness was Louisa Rasco, the wife of the murdered man. While the state's case went on as usual and met no resistance from the defense, the prosecutor made the mistake of trying to evoke some emotions. It's common in murder cases to bring in someone close to the victim, someone who will cry in front of the jury and give them even more grounds for a guilty verdict. Such testimony has no evidentiary value, but judges always allow it. Judge McDover, of course, allowed it, whatever the state wants. The problem was obvious, but the prosecutor somehow missed the obvious. Could he really expect Louise to cry and continue in the same spirit when her husband was caught with another woman whom she knew well? Was Louise saddened by his death, or was she secretly glad that his infidelity had been discovered? Fortunately, at least for the state, Louise was an emotional person, and soon after taking the oath she began to cry. Between sobs, she managed to finish a few sentences, and she continued to talk about what a good man Dream was, a wonderful father and, yes, a good husband. She misses him very much, as do her children. Svoboda objected, asking why all this is relevant to the case. McDover dismissed his objections. He had no questions for the witness during the cross-examination. She was taken away in tears. Most of the jurors, however, looked skeptical. Were some of those tears of joy that her two-faced husband had been caught? It's hard to say. Most observers questioned the prosecutor's move, but no real damage was done to the state's case. Prosecutor. His first name was Wagner, which was an extremely strange choice for his mother, but then it was her maiden name, and she decided that it suited him, at least while she was in the hospital. However, by the age of 10, he hated the name for many reasons and split it in half. For the last 30 years, he has been called Vag. Vag Dunlap. Voters seemed to like the strangeness of his name. Wag was thrilled to be on the hunt for his first death sentence. At that time, there were 300 people on death row in Florida, and none of them were sent there by the VAC. At the annual prosecutors' conference in Miami, he often felt inferior. Heavyweights were chosen to speak at seminars and exchange litigation tactics, but not Vegas. He had no medals on his chest. He had nothing to brag about over drinks. Of course, he had his share of convictions, and he successfully prosecuted 2 other murderers. Nothing even close to a death penalty case. Junior Mace was supposed to take him out into the open. And what a wonderful set of facts they gave him. It's a tasteless business. Junior, a good man, has been deceived by his friend's son, who has been sneaking out his back door for how long? Caught in the act, a fit of rage, 2 cold-blooded murders, and an accused who refused to use the protection of an irresistible impulse in a state of passion. Florida law has long recognized such protection, and Junior could have avoided the death penalty and possibly a long sentence if he had simply admitted that he acted in a state of temporary insanity and acted as many faithful husbands would have done. However, Junior stubbornly denied his guilt. And then why take the wallet? Why turn a terrible crime into something even more terrible? Murder in itself is not a basis for the imposition of a death sentence. Murder is necessary, plus something else: robbery, kidnapping, murder of a policeman or a child. The list is long. Why turn into a thief after just becoming a murderer? There will never be an explanation, because Junior denied everything. He caught them on the spot, killed them, took their wallet, and drove to a bar, where he got drunk and lost consciousness. The murder weapon, minus 4 of the 6 bullets in the weapon, and the wallet was found in his pickup truck. The facts lined up perfectly. The case was opened and closed. However, Wag, like most prosecutors, could not resist the temptation to pile on him in excess. Why settle for less when you can get more? Chapter 7. The 7th witness was Todd Short, the first of 2 prison informers. At the age of 24, he already had an impressive track record, mainly for crimes related to prohibited substances. Following Wag's firm instructions, he wore a long-sleeved shirt with a high collar to hide as many tattoos as possible. He also had a fresh haircut and wore glasses, which he didn't need, but because, according to Wag, they made him a little more intelligent. In Short's case, intelligence was a very relative matter. As if determined to get to the truth, he and Vag plunged headlong into Short's criminal past, and the guy honestly confessed to 3 previous arrests and 2 convictions for serious crimes. He served 5 years in prison before fixing his life. Now sober and God-fearing, he wanted to do the right thing. He said he was in Brunswick County Jail awaiting trial when Junior came to him. They were cellmates for only a few days, after which they were separated. He liked Junior, and having nothing else, they talked a lot. Junior was devastated by the betrayal of his wife and close friend, but he had no remorse about his actions. Didn't he do what any man would do? Junior said that he had suspicions, and he stopped by home in the middle of the day when he was delivering groceries. When he saw Son's pickup truck in the driveway, he realized that something was wrong. Going through the back door, Junior entered the room and heard a noise from the bedroom. They were on their own and didn't try to be quiet. He took the gun out of the drawer and kicked open the bedroom door. The sight of all these people entwined together like this infuriated him. Son shouted something stupid, like, "Wait, you don't understand," and was already getting off the bed when Junior shot him twice. Eileen screamed like an idiot and wouldn't shut up, so he shot her too. He stood there for a long time, looking at their bodies bleeding and dying, and he didn't care. Finally, he left and just drove around the city, trying to calm his nerves and not knowing what to do. The children were supposed to come home from school. He probably should have called the sheriff and called an ambulance. Oh, someone else will clean up after him. He stopped at a bar to have a couple of drinks to clear his head and just kept drinking. Junior listened stoically to all these lies, shaking his head slightly and looking at Short. At one point, he leaned towards Freedom and whispered, "I don't think I've ever seen him before." Short stuck to the script and was convincing. He spent hours rehearsing his testimony with Wag and his assistants, even sitting in this very chair on weekends with the courtroom doors closed and lawyers shouting questions. When Wag finally sat down and Svoboda stood up for cross-examination, Short took a deep breath and reminded himself to stay calm. He knew every question that would follow. Svoboda beat information out of him about his criminal record, about his time behind bars, about his addictions. The investigation of the charges against him had been dragging on for almost 15 months. Isn't it because the prosecutor was waiting for him to speak at the trial? No, of course not. Short did not know what the reason for the delay was. Sometimes the system just gets clogged up. In addition, Short was in the process of recovering from alcoholism, and this takes time. A successful recovery could have a positive effect on his sentence. Was Short promised anything in return for his testimony? Mitigation of punishment? Money? Of course not. Short was telling the truth. God help him. He wanted to serve his sentence and move on. A changed man? Has Short testified before and informed on a cellmate? No, never. Actually, this was Short's 3rd appearance on the witness stand, but his career as a serial snitch was not revealed by Freedom. The case had consumed the lawyer's life for the past 15 months, and he was tired of it. The meager fees paid by the staff covered only a small part of his time. Brother. Wilton Mays was sitting in the front row, as close to his brother as possible. There were several members of their tribe sitting behind him, almost all relatives of the Mace family. Across the aisle and on the other side of the deep chasm that split Tapacola, sat son Rasco's friends and relatives. There were other disagreements and factions, but most of the tribe stayed away. The tension didn't bother Wilton much. As the brother of an innocent man, he should have just supported him. He couldn't do anything else but sit there day after day, wondering about this travesty of justice and lies. He knew the truth, that his brother and Eileen were happily married, as only a couple can be in such circumstances, that she is not one of those who likes to go left, that son Rasco was a good man, devoted to his wife Louise and their children, that Junior will go to his grave grieving the loss of his wife and friend, that the murders were carefully orchestrated by criminals who dreamed of building a casino on Tapacola land. However, son Rasco and Junior Mace stood in their way. But Son and Eileen weren't killed by one of their own. The Tapacola were ready to hold a grudge, but they didn't kill each other. No, the killers were from the outside, and they committed what was becoming more and more an ideal crime day by day. The white man's ideas of justice were perplexing. How could they let a self-serving criminal like Todd Short put his hand on the Bible, swear to God to tell the truth, and then spin such a fantastic lie? What kind of justice system allows an experienced inmate to repeat words that he swears he heard in a prison cell a year earlier? Wilton watched the faces of the jury. They didn't just believe Short, they wanted to believe. Chapter 8. The eighth witness called by the state was Digger Robles, another prison informer. His criminal record was not as impressive as Todd Short's, nor was his physique. He was also wearing a white shirt with a high collar and long sleeves. Moreover, it was identical to the one worn by Short. Svoboda thought casually about asking Digger if Vag Dunlap had found such shirts on sale. Almost all of his tattoos were hidden, although one managed to crawl onto his neck and slip away from his collar. Nevertheless, Digger cleaned himself up and looked relaxed, preparing to explain his inventions to the jury for an hour. The only truth he told was his memories of 2 convictions, 3 years in prison, and a struggle with methamphetamine. Wag let him go through these trifling preludes of his, as if they had absolutely no meaning. Then we moved on to the story and the truth. In testimony that was surprisingly, and sometimes strikingly, similar to Short's, he spoke in great detail about his short time in custody with Junior. This man was proud of what he had done. He caught them in his own bed, shot each of them twice, defended his honor, and why the hell is the state of Florida dragging him to jail and to court? If this had happened on Indian soil, Junior would have been celebrated as a hero. He didn't show the slightest hint of remorse. Svoboda leaned over to his client and asked, "Do you remember him?" Junior whispered, "Maybe." During cross-examination, Svoboda managed to land several blows when he argued with Digger about his motives. If he wasn't promised anything, why did he testify? Digger said he didn't really want to testify, didn't want to get involved in this case, but he's an important witness because he heard comments about the damage done. Svoboda reminded him that he had spent a lot of time behind bars and asked if he had ever heard anyone else admit to wrongdoing like that. When Digger replied that he didn't, several jurors shook their heads in disbelief. But overall, it was a great performance. When Digger left the witness stand, Wag Dunlap announced, "The staff is done with the witnesses. Observer." He came and went throughout the trial, always choosing a different place and always in a different look. He changed caps, glasses, clothes, and even completely shaved off his beard after the first 2 days of testimony. He skipped a few hours here and there, then half a day, then appeared in leather clothes. Not a single person in the courtroom knew his name, and no one paid any attention to him. His name was Delgado, and he worked for a tight-knit and well-organized gang of organized criminals who decided to build a casino on the Tapacola reservation. His duties varied widely, but his value to the gang lay in his talents with firearms and his ability to eliminate people without leaving evidence. During the trial, Delgado marveled at the incompetence of the prosecution. Unger's autopsy was carried out hastily and carelessly. And why not? The causes of death were so obvious. Why dig deeper? Son's blood test would have shown the presence of phenobarbital, a strong barbiturate that Delgado injected. If he had been discovered, Delgado had no doubt that the state's prosecution theory would have been slightly modified to include the fact that Son had taken pills before his date with Eileen. A thorough analysis would show that at the time of death, the dream was unconscious. In the heat of the moment, the police did not bother to check Junior's hands for traces of gunpowder residue. Such a simple and routine check would have shown that he did not fire a .38 caliber pistol. There were no fingerprints on the gun. But then Montgomery, a ballistics expert, assumed that Junior had simply wiped the gun. The state also did not perform a blood test on Junior while he was in the hospital. The analysis, as expected, would have shown the presence of alcohol, as well as chloral hydrate. At the bar, Delgado lured Junior into a game of darts and managed to exchange bottles of beer. In the snitches, Delgado listened to their speculation and tried his best to hide a smile. Junior's supposed confessions were a joke. They got it all wrong. Eileen entered first. Delgado persuaded her to enter the house, took out a gun, forced her to undress in the bedroom, and then shot her twice. Then he took Son into the bedroom, undressed him, and shot him. The problem with the snitches was that they often recanted their testimony and changed their stories. Delgado knew this well, as did the people he worked for. Watching Todd Short and Digger Robles perform and almost laughing at their inventions, he knew that he would soon receive an order to remove them. Wait until the trial is over, until Junior is taken away, until endless appeals begin. and begin the process of planning, harassment, waiting. Their testimony was now permanently recorded and could be read into the record in the event of a retrial, although such a scenario did not worry his bosses. The dream was dead. Junior would have been sidelined for quite a long time. The opposition was defeated. The casino will be built. Chapter 9. The first witness called by the defense was a teenager named Heath. His family owned a country store near the small town of Larkin, about 30 miles from the crime scene. The store sold propane for heating and cooking and had a contract with Junior's employer to collect empty cylinders and restock once a week. At about 1400 hours on January 17th, Junior delivered 10 20-pound cylinders and took 10 empty ones. Heath signed a delivery ticket, but no specific time was specified. He testified that it was around 1400 hours, give or take, but could not say more precisely. He said he saw Junior almost every week and that they usually chatted for a few minutes during each delivery. He estimated that Junior had been in his store for less than 15 minutes. Svoboda took out a large map of 3 counties, Walton, Brunswick, and Okaloosa, and marked on it the location of the Heath family store and the Mays house. The second witness called by the defense was Lynn McGuire, the owner of a nursery and garden store in Defuniak Springs. Mr. McGuire sold a lot of propane and did business with Junior's company for many years. On the day of the murder, he remembered that Junior had arrived for his weekly detour at about 3 p.m. He handed over a dozen propane cylinders and took the empty ones. He presented a sales receipt with a detailed description of the operation, but it did not specify a specific time. This has never been done, he told the jury. Since the time of the 2 deaths was estimated to be between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m., Mr. McGuire had to see Junior after he had just killed his wife and son Rasko. Svoboda asked him a lot of questions about Junior's behavior. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It's the same old Junior. The third witness called by the defense was a retired state trooper named Taggart. With the small budget that Judge McDover reluctantly allowed Freedom to spend on experts, he hired Taggart for $1,000. Standing in front of the jury box and holding a pointer in his hands, Taggart pointed out places on an enlarged map. Number 1 was the village store where Heath worked. The second room was Mr. McGuire's garden shop. Number 3 is the Mays house. The fourth room was Junior's employer's warehouse in Moorville. Assuming Junior made his delivery at 2 p.m. and it took about 15 minutes, as Heath claimed, then Junior left around 2:15 p.m. and went to Mr. McGuire's for the next delivery. Taggart made this trip 3 times, and it took an average of 23 minutes. So, around 2:35 p.m., Junior arrived at Mr. McGuire's, spent 15 minutes doing what he had to do, and left around 2:50 p.m. At that moment, he was 20 minutes from his house. If he had hurried there, he could have arrived around 15:10. According to the conclusion of the pathologist, death occurred between 1400 hours and 1500 hours. However, the pathologist hastened to explain that this time interval is not accurate and can fluctuate by half an hour in any direction. Even under direct interrogation, the defense theory was not convincing. A few minutes here and a few minutes there, and nothing concrete. The exact time was not fixed. The memories were not so clear. Did Junior make his delivery at 2 p.m., or was it more likely at 1:45 p.m.? Were they shot at 1500 hours, or rather at 1530? On cross-examination, the theory was destroyed. Vag Dunlap led Taggart along the roads and highways until it became quite clear that Junior Mace could actually finish delivering to the Heath family store at 2 p.m., then rush home because he suspected something, catch his wife in bed with a friend, deal with this case, hurry to Mr. McGuire and arrive there shortly after 1500 hours, pretending that everything is in order. Did Junior have time to rush to his employer's warehouse, jump into his own pickup truck, and then rush home to commit murders? Perhaps, Wag suggested, although it was unclear. For 2 hours, Wag harassed Taggart with questions about time and distances. Svoboda objected. McDover dismissed the objection. The lawyers were bickering. The heat of passion was growing. In the end, Taggart lost his temper. Svoboda again demanded the cancellation of the trial. The judge asked him to sit down. The jury was disappointed. The audience was amused at first, then bored. Junior Mace sat stoically in the midst of this chaos, occasionally shaking his head at all these inventions. Chapter 10. After the alibi disappeared, The defense had nothing left but the defendant himself. Svoboda followed conventional wisdom in advising Junior not to appear in court, but Junior did not want to rule it out. If he is given a chance to tell the truth, he will not refuse. In a deep, slow voice, he measured out his words and stared unwaveringly at the jury. Svoboda asked him the easiest questions regarding Junior's biography: education, work, family, no criminal record, no divorce, 3 children. He loved Eileen, and sleep was his closest friend. No, they weren't having an affair, and no, he didn't find them in bed. He denied having a gun and testified that he did not know any Tapacola residents who had one. It wasn't part of their culture. Several men hunted deer for food, but no one in his family did it. He sometimes drank beer, but did not consider himself a lover of strong drinks. He and Eileen never kept alcohol in their house. He spoke about his people and their deep disagreements over the proposal to build a casino on their land. He and Song led the opposition to this proposal, and they won the first election by a narrow margin. The vote split their tribe into warring camps. Whoever killed Sun and Eileen was now doing a great job of framing him. Remove Sun, remove Junior, and the casino will be built. Vag stood up and pleaded, "I protest. Please, Your Honor. Do we have any evidence? This is a rather wild theory, unsupported by anything." "I agree. Accepted. Mr. Svoboda, please limit the testimony to something similar to the facts." January 17th was a normal day for Junior. In the morning, he made a detour and had lunch at the village store, where he also made a delivery. At about 2 p.m., he stopped by the Heath family store, handed over and picked up 10 propane cylinders and drove about half an hour to Mr. McGuire's house. As always, he was in no hurry and drove at a low speed. He didn't make a detour, didn't go home because there was no reason to, and finished his business at Mr. McGuire's around 3 p.m. After that, he stopped at 2 more stores before striking the office hours at 1641. On the way home, he stopped by one of his favorite bars, said hello to Spike, had a couple beers, and everything was fine. He didn't remember much after that. He lost consciousness, but not from 2 bottles of beer, but from something else, and did not remember anything until he woke up in the hospital. His voice trembled slightly as he tried to explain what it was like to hear that his wife had been murdered, and about an hour later he was informed that he was accused of murder. He was handcuffed, dragged, taken to prison, thrown into a cell, deprived of the opportunity to attend his wife's funeral and burial, and deprived of the opportunity to grieve with his children. He was so traumatized that it was difficult for him to talk, eat, and sleep. It was a nightmare that would never end. Son, Patrick Mace, 14 years old, the eldest of Junior's 3 children. Due to the cruelty of many of the testimony, young Patrick has not been allowed into the courtroom until today. His younger brother and sister won't see anything from the trial. Patrick was the first to come home from school, the first in the house, an unhappy soul who stumbled upon corpses and an indescribable crime scene. He didn't remember calling 911. He didn't remember anything at all. The first deputy found him lying on the porch, curled up in a fetal position, shaking, unable to speak or walk. Patrick spent 2 nights in the hospital and is still seeing a psychologist. It is not surprising that Vag Dunlap wanted to call the child as one of the prosecution's witnesses, immediately impressed the jury with the fact that the child is crying, sobbing, and cannot continue to speak. Svoboda objected, but McDover agreed. Fortunately, the Mays family resisted so fiercely that Wag retreated. Watching his father fight for his life, Patrick struggled with his own emotions. Tears flooded his eyes and flowed down his cheeks. He wiped them on his sleeve and tried not to look at Uncle Wilton sitting next to him. Losing my mother was inconceivable. Losing my father would be the end of the world. Wilton explained the truth to him. He knew his father was innocent. Chapter 11. In his closing remarks, Vag Dunlap decided to smash the victims. If Sun and Eileen weren't having an affair, then what the hell were they doing? Can you think of another good reason why Sun, who knew Eileen very well, came to her house around 2 p.m. on Tuesday, when Junior was at work and the kids were at school? There was no other reason, and the accused, who, as it turned out, has a rather vivid imagination, could not invent it out of thin air. What should be obvious, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is actually quite obvious. They were having an affair, and Junior either knew about it or was very suspicious. He timed his movements almost perfectly, giving himself a short but plausible window to zip past the house and see if Son's pickup truck was in the driveway. And he was there. His worst suspicions turned out to be correct. He caught them, killed them, did what he had to do, and continued to deliver propane. Later, when reality set in, he got drunk, got caught, and showed no remorse for the murders, at least in prison. The chief. From the first row of the small balcony, the leader looked sadly at the courtroom. His people were so divided. To his left and behind the defendant sat members of the Mace family and several friends. To his right and behind the prosecution sat members of Rasko's family and several friends. Two sheriff's deputies guarded the passageway, ready to make sure that these groups did not create problems. There were other residents of Tapacola in the courtroom, more curious than concerned. They treated the casino favorably, could almost see and feel its riches. For or against. No gray areas, no indecision. Each Tapacola was firmly in one camp or the other. His tribe voted against it almost 3 years ago, when son Rasko and Junior Mace campaigned against casinos on the tribe's land. They considered gambling to be nothing more than another curse of the white man, and they barely won. Now that son is dead and Junior has gone to jail, the tribe will vote again and the casino will be built. Prosperity was just around the corner, and this pleased the leader. Perhaps in a few years, money will be able to resolve the differences. With the money, they will build good houses and excellent schools, lots of roads, parks, and clinics, and each Tapacola will receive its share of wealth. The casino will lift them out of poverty and reunite his tribe. It was his dream, but so far, the sight of Junior being chased was heartbreaking. The chief knew what all his people knew. They could argue, fight, and hold grudges for decades, but the Tapacola didn't kill each other. Chapter 12. The best moment of Larry Svoboda's trial occurred during his closing speech. He told the jury they had no choice but to believe Junior's claims of innocence because he refused to take advantage of the most obvious defense. Svoboda hypothesized that any husband who walked in on his cheating wife would almost certainly claim that what followed was an act of rage, an act of passion, an irresistible impulse that could not be controlled. Such protection has long been recognized in our country's criminal law, and juries have often shown sympathy in such cases. The fact that Junior refused to claim that he acted in a fit of temporary insanity meant only one thing. He did not catch on cheating and did not kill his wife and his friend. Junior didn't cheat for his life and didn't cheat the system. Rather, he was just telling the truth. The jury? Maybe. But the defendant's problem was that he had no evidence. The witnesses to his alibi were not firm and convincing. He could claim that he was drugged and framed, and then he became a victim of planted evidence. But where was his evidence? In fact, all the evidence was stacked in favor of the state. Chapter 13. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before reaching a unanimous verdict of guilty on both counts. The audience did not gasp, scream, or moan, did not resent injustice, did not smile. Only a few quiet tears from the Rasko family and a few drooping shoulders of the crowd behind Mace. Junior listened to the decision without flinching. Svoboda seemed to know this was going to happen. Wag and his gang hid their smug grins. The jurors were impassive, of course, unhappy, but determined to finish their cases. Only young Patrick was depressed, and he collapsed into the arms of his Uncle Wilton. Judge McDover dismissed the jury with instructions to return at 9 the next morning, when the trial resumes with sentencing. The question of guilt has been resolved. Next, the jury had to determine which they would choose, death or life imprisonment without parole. Observer. He lingered for a moment after the break and, as the crowd silently left the courtroom, watched as Junior was handcuffed and led away. Delgado didn't feel any sadness. No remorse. Quite the opposite. Throughout his long career as a murderer, he often thought about how exciting it would be to pull off the perfect job, a job done so incredibly well that they convicted someone else. How cool would it be to watch the trial? At that moment, he had to admit that it was very cool, and this delight could not be described. The end.